The title of my paper is Go West Young Firm, the Value of Entrepreneurial Migration for Startups and Their Founders. And let me begin motivating what we're going to be talking about here by talking about curing depression through cell phones. So in 2010, Sandy Pentland, who's the director of the Human Dynamics Lab at the MIT Media Lab, and Anmol Madan, who's a PhD student of his, developed an algorithm to predict mental health needs based on how people use their cell phones. Right? If you're depressed, maybe you look at your phone less, you call different people, you sort of text different things, say different things. Potentially, that could be useful. They decided to create a company based on this technology. The company is called Ginger.io. And the first thing that they did to create a company was, in fact, go down to downtown Boston. And well, they first went to the state of Delaware, registered a Delaware corporation, then went to downtown Boston and registered as a Delaware corporation, doing business in Massachusetts. Through time, they added a second person called Karen Singh and started getting some traction. So they got into an accelerator here in Boston called Techstars, who's sort of a high reputation accelerator. And then eventually in 2012, they decided to move to San Francisco rather than stay here in Boston. And you know, in part because they got some venture capital money in San Francisco, in part because Karen's fiance was going to be doing her residency at University of California, San Francisco. Today, Ginger.io is a thriving middle stage kind of venture-backed company. It has $28 million in VC financing and about 40 employees. So it seems to be doing well after moving from here, in this case, to San Francisco. And when you think about this dynamic, this sort of phenomena where startups start somewhere and then relatively early in their lifetime, they move somewhere else, and then they seem to be successful in that other place, it's not totally uncommon in sort of recent history. So you can think Dropbox and Netscape, Facebook and Microsoft actually moved here from Cambridge as well as Dropbox to different locations, and then eventually they became very successful. The purpose of this paper is to try to study this phenomena and ask, we see these companies migrating, what is in fact the value of entrepreneurial migration for growth-oriented startups and their founders? So this sort of theoretically, this choice of location really juxtaposes two different benefits of location that pull founders in different choices. On the one hand, there's what people have called a home field advantage. Being located in a place where you're at home, Ginger.io being located close to MIT, where they had a strong network, where they had strong history, where they had already done Techstars, that leads to some improvement in performance, right? You have access to the right networks, you have access to the right knowledge, it's easier access to resources. On the other hand, there's also a very sort of natural alternative that is agglomeration, right? You might have there's different locations, have different supply of resources, and in some locations you might have better access to them, but in the other location, there's just sort of more of them, and it might be, eventually easier to or more productive to access those, even if you're less effective at doing so. And sort of existing studies so far have not focused on trying to understand the contrast of these two effects in the case of growth-oriented startups relocating to prime entrepreneurship locations, such as could be Boston or kind of San Francisco, or locations like that. And sort of, we're going to talk about that. Let me explain to you first the empirical approach. So what we'd like to do is just look at ideally, we'd like to study this relationship, right, which is the effect of moving to a place like Silicon Valley on an outcome variable called Y, which in here is called YI. But obviously, if you just ran that regression, you'd have a selection bias that would make your beta look higher than it really is, right? So you see a higher effect than it should be because there's positive sorting to that location, as well as when you think about counterfactuals, you might think about you might see the migrants and don't realize that the migrants are both better fit for Silicon Valley, as well as the people that stay behind are just lower productivity in general. Obviously, what we'd want is some sort of random assignment, but assigning high growth startups to different locations is hard, and so potentially a different option a well-known estimation approach has always been selection and observables. Now, selection and observables in the past is always sort of considered an insufficient approach to do so, because there's sort of always this sense that you haven't control for enough confounders, and there's too many research degrees of freedom trying to understand what you put into a regression, such that the results are hard to believe. In this paper, right, we're going to use I'm going to use advances in machine learning that have come recently to try to use a more recent method of selection observables that moves beyond these two objections, and hopefully get to a better estimate. And then I'll show you some other complementary analysis trying to show that it is able to account for a large amount of variation. To do that, we're going to build on some of my prior work, try to measure the quality of startups based on the idea that if you're able to capture companies, so I showed you those registration documents, like the one Ginger.io had. If you're able to capture companies when they're starting out, and if you're able to see things about those companies when they're starting out, right? If you're able to see how they register, whether they patent, etc., you might be able to characterize their quality at the time they're starting out and create much better sort of. Then you have different. If you have a good measure of that, you're able to understand differences in the expected performance of firms and really kind of ask yourself, what would have been the success, for example, of a migrant, have it stayed at home, and sort of trying to use that as a better counterfactual. So using characteristics at the time of founding, and every company registered across 26 US states, and characteristics like where they're patenting, using a trademark, how they're naming the firm, I'll create a predictive model that says, what is the likelihood that you achieve a growth outcome, right, based on how you look at the time you're starting out, and quality is going to be the prediction of that model. So let me kind of skip the data, but I'll just say it's 26 states accounting for about 70% of the US GDP, and looking at migrations across those states. Right, so in terms of summary statistics, we see ample differences between the average number of firms that move and the average number of movers in different outcomes, particularly for those that move to Silicon Valley, right? So even though sort of within people that, within all companies founded, only 0.25% move to Silicon Valley, they account for almost 3% of IPOs and acquisitions, as well as other kind of outcomes. We still have to, we obviously care about this selection, so I do a predictive model using a random forest, 50% sample of non-migrants, right? And the model turns out to work really well. So this is an ROC curve. The ROC score out of sample is 0.85. It suggests it's able to account for 70% of the variation. And sort of kind of that graph gives you a sense. And I'm going to separate that training sample. I'm going to keep it out, and I'm going to use the rest of the analysis with the remaining of the sample. This is the main estimate. So on top over here, we have what you might call a naive estimate, just looking at, these are the odds of selling a company, right, being IPO or being acquired, based on moving. If you do the naive estimator, you would estimate that the increase is about 8x, but once you kind of do the machine learning approach, that comes down to about 4x, using sort of all kind of the technology that I've explained. It is an estimate that's robust across different samples. Not all of them are significant, but all of them are positive, as well as across different outcomes. Companies are not just more likely to sell themselves, but also patent more, trademark more, get more VC financing, and get more sales. Of course, you kind of would worry about these unobservables, and sort of, even though there's a machine learning approach, is it enough? And so I used two tests to test for two different things. One being that there are, the machine learning model is not able to create good comparables at the time the company's starting out. And the second one is that there's productivity shocks after the company's starting out. So I'll skip those for now, but let me show you a separate complementary approach that you can also use, which is to put this data in a panel model, right? So besides looking at this kind of cross-section machine learning, you can simply create a panel and have firm fixed effects and age fixed effects and identify off of that time to move, time to move variation, right? So companies controlling for fixed difference of the companies and differences at different age of the company. Can you still see difference between those movers that decide to move, based on when they're choosing to move in the outcomes? And basically, so the title there should be time to move specific coefficients, but basically you see a very similar effect, right? So you do see more patenting, you see more trademarks, kind of more commercialization, more venture financing, and more a higher likelihood of selling the company. When you do the ratio with, for example, a matched set of companies that did not move and look at the mean of that versus the movers, the average change in odds looks as well really similar, including in the outcome of company sale. So there's a bunch of other heterogeneity tests in the paper, but I'll just emphasize this second part in this presentation, and it is that behind every startup trying to be successful, right, presumably there are founders trying to be wealthy, or let's take that as a first order approximation. And so you want to ask not just what's the value of moving for the startup, but perhaps what's the value of moving for the founder in their own wealth. And it turns out, I do a back of the envelope exercise. It comes down to, used under certain assumptions, to about an expectation of about $1.2 million of wealth, right? Which might or might not be enough to warrant the migration. Housing is expensive over there. If you have a spouse, and the present value of their income could be much higher than that very easily, as well as the cost of kind of loved ones. And in fact, when you look at the movers that are famous, Mark Zuckerberg, Netscape, and Facebook, and Dropbox, they turn out to be usually very young. So potentially, one hypothesis is that they have much lower personal costs rather than company cost in moving, and that this issue is binding. And I'll just, I do a hand-collected sample, and then I'll show you the scatter plots since I'm out of time that sort of supports that people are less likely to move with age, and when they move, they need a company with a higher potential if they're older to kind of compensate for the higher personal cost. So I think I'm out of time, but so with that, entrepreneur migration is a common phenomenon, and it sort of puts a different perspective that is not just the home field advantage, but you also got to think about the agglomeration. Thank you.